If you were to Google Holywood Church, Dumfriesshire, or Templar Bells at the time this video was released, you might have come across a legal conflict headlining the search. A conflict between Digger and I and the local planning authority and the Scottish Government. Conflict because we took two church bells, protected under planning law, and two medieval wall plaques from this dilapidated church and placed them into secure storage off-site. I say might have read because we are attempting to redirect any internet search to the real issue, as the planning conflict is merely a consequence of the deliberate denigration of the public's understanding of Scottish history via academic and institutional bigotry. The subjective dismissal of our history by the political, academic and bureaucratic establishment. In this case, the dismissal concerns the only provenance significant Knights Templar artefacts in the world, two Knights Templar presbytery bells sponsored by a Scottish Templar master. Dismissed all because the discovery and the understanding we confirm through evidence does not suit the establishment's or academics' philosophical or institutional narrative or its prejudice. We removed the bells to keep the already exposed unique and precious archaeology from a former Knights Templar church safe and protected while the property remained empty, disused and dilapidated, requiring millions of pounds in investment, including new roof coverings, new floors, wiring, deep excavation throughout, and with it significant archaeological investigation, with significant associated structural engineering works, all before the church could be converted into new use. And while we sought authoritative authentication for the bells' Knights Templar provenance, so we could pass the church and the bells to a new, more appropriate owner or keeper, without further misrepresenting the important history of the site. Misrepresentation that was created over 100 years ago by Victorian historians and cemented, unaudited, into the record by academia as fact. But we did so without asking planning permission from the local council. We broke the law. UK planning laws exist to ensure the sustainability of the nation's heritage. So any redevelopment of heritage sites sympathetically retains the site's historic nature and cultural value. Some countries and cultures do not care about national history or heritage. Some even actively destroy it if it conflicts with the political or religious philosophy of the current ruling party. I'm glad to say the UK is not one of those countries, for the moment. The key word is sustainability. This concept headlines both planning regulation and heritage conservation in law and in government and local government policy. It is a very sound concept. It means when historic buildings such as Holywood Church loses its original purpose, that is, as a place of worship, and is in danger of falling into disrepair through disuse, the building and its history is conserved through new purpose. But new purpose without compromising the ability of future generations to appreciate the building for what it once was, but still allow it to meet the future needs of society. Sustainability balances on three core pillars: historic environmental protection, economic viability, and social benefit. In Holywood Church's case, closing its doors at the end of the last century to Christian worship, and with no community use envisaged or needed, it was proposed it should become a dwelling, housing families for generations to come. A building sympathetically refurbished and repurposed away from the ecclesiastical, developing the old into new purpose, while retaining its historic character, which included its church bells. The plan for Holywood Church was sound enough, if those that had drawn up the plan had built that plan on the three pillars of sustainability and understood the site. Key to ensuring sustainability is to comprehensively understand the heritage in question, its cultural and historical value, and any constraints this presents. So those constraints can be managed sympathetically, and thus any reuse can be sustained. It's a basic principle, and why we employ specialist conservation architects and archaeological and environmental agents to ensure any sustainable conservation plan for the reuse of the old is workable. We always need to comprehensively understand what we are dealing with. It makes absolute sense. No surgeon would operate without knowing exactly what they were cutting into and the exact nature of the operation, what the risks were involved, and what the outcome should be. Thus, comprehension is a core principle repeated in the Scottish Government's heritage policy and the local heritage plans, including the local development plan here in Dumfries and Galloway. Understandably, any and all actions, including any decision making by the establishment and heritage owners, is directed towards achieving understanding the heritage in question and maintaining and delivering the three core pillars of heritage sustainability. But as we illustrate through these videos, as demonstrated by the behaviours and reception of all those agents we have encountered in the last 5 years, and those we have crossed swords with, these core principles of heritage conservation and sustainability seem to have been lost somewhere along the road. A paradox is a self-contradictory situation where reality conflicts with intent. In the case of Holywood Church, the absurd behaviours of those that are meant to ensure its conservation are actually contributing to its demise. Because the establishment, the local council, the Scottish Government and its agent Historic Environment Scotland, are refusing to acknowledge the extraordinary nature and realities of the archaeology here at Holywood. Not through objective appraisal, but through prejudiced denial, disregarding the archaeological evidence simply because the establishment does not respect the finders, regardless of the merit they present, nor likes challenge to its authority and its own understanding incompetently formed, feeding its own poor decision making. The establishment, in its attempt to circumvent the merit clearly demonstrated in Digger and I's archaeological investigation, relies on the argument the provenance of the bells has no bearing on the site's conservation, or the public's understanding of the site, nor the realities of the future treatment of the archaeology, the bells, or the church containing both. It is a ridiculous argument, demonstrating just how delinquent the establishment is, and how we as a society have allowed it to become. We have governance filled with idiocy, not acumen, not virtue, nor wisdom. In 2019, Digger and I paid £54,000 for a church valued at £35,000 because the building came with planning permissions and a conservation plan already created by the last owner cum developer. However, on possession of the building, it was clear there was a fundamental lack of comprehension regarding the site's archaeology. In fact, the archaeology on the site had been negligently overlooked, resulting in an unworkable conservation plan for the church. A conservation plan that was neither economically viable, with a cost of refurbishment in the millions, nor appropriate to the extraordinary nature of the Knights Templar archaeology. A conservation plan that failed to take into account, through ignorance, the significant public interest and traffic to the site the archaeology would generate, removing any quiet enjoyment of the occupants of any new proposed dwelling. Instead of understanding the archaeology that constrained the site's redevelopment, the previous developers' architects and archaeological agents simply assumed there would be archaeology, but failed to carry out any kind of comprehensive desktop exercise to understand it. In fact, the previous developer's archaeological agent failed to even inspect any of the on-site archaeology at Holywood during their inspection. There was no environmental survey on the church which would have detected the high humidity problems, or the two bat colonies living in the church walls. And so there was no plan for the long-eared and pipistrelle bat preservation, which had an impact on how any new owner would progress the work. Even the former owner, the Church of Scotland, must have known about the significant problems the building presented, as it unearthed some of the archaeology in 1965 and understood why no water or sewage services had been installed into the church in its 300-year ownership. Yet it still misled the sale by presenting the church as a workable house conversion. The Church of Scotland also negligently reported the bells as a quirky feature. But the bells were anything but quirky. They were the original bells from the founding of the Abbey, the most significant medieval artefacts in Scotland. Overlooked due to incompetence and negligence, the products of disinterest in the church's heritage and its future conservation. The artifacts are unique remnants from a Knights Templar order, a fact any competent historical audit would have confirmed, because the evidence and testimony were already on record. But competence is absent in this affair, and I'm afraid this catalogue of gross incompetence persists today in the poor decision-making, prejudiced and ignorant behaviour and deliberate deceit of the Scottish heritage establishment, which we'll revisit again and again in other videos, until common sense prevails over foolishness. In 2020, Digger and I, like the public campaign before us in 2009 and 2010, did not want the bells lost hidden in the church tower, never to be appreciated by the public. We had the idea to display the bells as a signpost to the site's former ecclesiastical history, either in the local museum or on site, probably in the hearse house. And so we originally sought planning permissions with the local council to do this. But to display the bells as a signpost, the bells had to be properly described, and it was clear the bells' 16th century dating, listed as the site's special interest on the historic property record, was grossly incorrect. There was no evidence on the bells that supported this theory whatsoever. So Digger and I set about re-evaluating the bells' history from all available record and understanding. One bell was universally confirmed by bell historians as a pre-1200 design, and certainly design replaced by the 13th century. The pre-1200 design was superseded by a lighter, squatter bell design using considerably less expensive bell metal in its construction, while improving harmonics. The other bell had been reported in the 18th century with a date of 1154. If these reports were correct, and the abbey was founded in the mid-part of the 12th century, it was a strong possibility these were the original bells from the founding of Holywood Abbey, an important reconsideration of the bell's special interest. It was in the course of investigating the bell's sponsor that presented the abbey as founded not as an abbey for a regular monastic order, but as a Knights Templar presbytery, which made the bells the only remaining Knights Templar provenance artifact in the world, and a significant departure from the abbey bells, elevating the bell's special interest significantly further. Check out chapter 4, link below, to understand what was engraved on the bells and the nature of their sponsor, or read our archaeological report, free to download, on our website. Thus, we withdrew our original planning application while we carried out further investigation before we could consider consigning the bells to either the local museum or the hearse house. Because as we began to comprehensively understand the historic value of the bells, and by default the site, this new understanding required a new conservation plan. By 2021, finding we had the world's only provenance Knights Templar artifacts, two bells from a former Templar presbytery that sat on this very spot here in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, and fearing for their security after we had dropped them to the ground floor to allow closer, safe inspection, We removed the bells from the dilapidated church temporarily into secure vaulted storage. I suspect any rational person finding themselves in such unexpected ownership of unique and extraordinarily high value medieval artefacts would do the same. Before we removed the bells from the site, we had relied on secrecy to maintain security. Every time we sent out our first version of our archaeological report for review, we asked for confidentiality. We did not want to advertise what was on site until we were ready, as security was always a concern on the Holywood site. The last developer had to move onto the site to counter the vandalism that you see in the broken windows, and I did the same. We've experienced several incidents over the years, but fortunately, with the exception of a great deal of lost sleep, with alarms going off in the dead of night, and 2 teeth lost in a violent encounter with 2 miscreants intent on harming the church, in the most part my presence has deterred further harm. But this situation dramatically changed in the summer of 2023. We recorded a sharp increase in the numbers of late-night visitors to the graveyard, not the open cemetery, but the ancient closed graveyard directly around the church. We cannot say why the visitors were there. After all, it was a public space. But the timing was unusual. No one expects sightseers between midnight and 4 in the morning. Men in vans rather than dog walkers, family groups and ghost hunters. When politely challenged, when I appeared with torch in hand, most immediately retreated. However, some were abusive and in 2 cases violent. But it was an arson attack in 2023 to a nearby historic convent less than 3 miles away from Holywood that set our teeth on edge. Arsonists were at large. Although we were in the countryside rather than the town where the arson took place, it was a risk too much to bear, especially as the rural location was no protection against vandal attack, as evidenced by the church's broken windows. We had already had an incident of a car being burned out near the gates of the cemetery, the result of an attempted homicide, and having around 200 kilograms of bronze metal conveniently crated and relatively portable for the opportunist thief was, to say the least, a concern. But even with the bells hanging in the tower, 1 man and 30 minutes, a spanner and a rope was all that was required to remove the bells. And with us promoting the bells as priceless Templar artifacts, and regardless of the heritage establishment's prejudiced avoidance of the bells' Templar provenance, the evidence was published for all to read, and any rational, objective person would read the Templar provenance as genuine. So the temptation to steal or even destroy was a real threat. And so, in order to avoid public consultation and any time delay that seeking permission from the local council would entail, we removed the bells off-site without council permission, taking the bells into secret, secure storage. Digger and I broke the planning laws of Scotland. In 2024, we proposed a new conservation plan to the council, which involved asking the local authority and several heritage agencies in Scotland, as well as the institutional church in Scotland, for help with authoritative authentication for the bells, and advice how we may promote this new history for Scotland's benefit. And in turn, assistance in ensuring the bells found a new keeper, distributing finance raised while helping the bells find a new, more suitable home considering their remarkable provenance, in a museum, collection or another church, with a new financed conservation plan from us guaranteeing a publicly accessible archaeological project at Holywood, with the church purposed and refurbished afterwards as a signpost to the archaeology found, with the building subsidised into the future, guaranteeing a signpost to the history of the site with replica bells on display, all with a new keeper and developer. A new keeper, because after all, Digger and I were looking for a new home to make, not a museum to manage. But with no support offered by the council, nor the heritage sector in Scotland, nor the Scottish Institutional Church, we shelved any plans to coerce new owners to commit to the future of the church, and sought to transfer the church and its Templar archaeology to new keepers, with no guarantees from us to shape the church's future, accepting the commercial reality any value in the site to a new keeper was in its bells and not the church, nor its interred archaeology. We knew this because Digger and I had already rejected international proposals to buy the church and bells. It was clear these new potential keepers had no intention of developing the church, as the building itself had no commercial viability. Several commercial agents also had serious misgivings on the viability and commercial sustainability of a museum at Holywood. And without state, local authority, local community or private charitable commitment, it was doubtful the building as a museum would be sustainable. I must admit, obtaining retrospective planning permission to remove the bells was more about coercing authentication for our find than it was adherence to the law. It was our original intent to keep the matter secret until we had authentication for the bells in our pocket. Because with authoritative authentication, we guarantee the council would have had an entirely different attitude to any planning issue. After all, what idiots would enforce planning when the original property listing was so fundamentally flawed? Proper reappraisal of the bells would dictate the bells should be released into appropriate care for what they were, objects of national importance. The truth is the bells should have never have been disposed of with the church. If the bells had been properly understood, they would have been removed to a museum as soon as they had completed their role in the parish, if not sooner, considering their immense value and importance. But of course, in seeking retrospective planning permission, we encountered the same prejudiced avoidance of the discovery we had found elsewhere. There are three key players in the decision making with regards to our conflict with the council over the conservation of the Holywood site and obtaining retrospective planning permission to remove the Templar bells of Scotland to safety. One player is the local council's own archaeological officer, the same officer who failed to evaluate the archaeological evidence here at Holywood in 2021. The same officer who has failed to follow up with any site visit or any appraisal of the archaeology found during the development works here at Holywood, or offer any advice on how we should treat the archaeology as per the officer's remit. It is clear the council's archaeological officer did not want to be drawn into the appraisal of the archaeology here at Holywood, despite the officer's qualification to read the archaeological report. And considering the report is accessible to even the layperson, the officer had no excuse not to appraise the evidence. It is a familiar story. The officer refuses to offer expert testimony in either challenge, support or disavowal. It was clear, however, the officer had read the report because the officer took detail from it but avoided any comment that either challenged the report or agreed with it. The officer simply confirmed an archaeological report existed. Therefore, the officer deliberately ignored the evidence of the constraining archaeology under the church floors or the catastrophic problems the archaeology caused. Problems that prevented the church being realistically converted under the existing planning proposal. The officer operating in the heritage sector was well aware of the issues that prevented authoritative authentication of the discovery, and knew without authentication for the bells, and with the extent of the archaeology under the church requiring significant and costly archaeological intervention,
the church could never be redeveloped, nor the bells preserved, without third-party state or charitable involvement. The officer ignored the issues and failed to offer any support because the officer was part of the same prejudice we had encountered universally. With regard to our retrospective planning permission, the officer made highly subjective decisions, feigning ignorance of the evidence, and even lied to condemn our actions, claiming we had not reported the archaeology to the officer or the council. The second player is Historic Environment Scotland, the government's heritage agency, which I covered in chapters 7, 8 and 9. The links are below. I will not dwell on the agency's extensive misbehaviour, well documented in press reports from 2025 and discussed in chapters 7, 8 and 9. I will only restate the agency also refused to engage with the archaeological evidence without good reason, and chose to subjectively present the bells as nothing more than medieval, created sometime between 1095 and 1601, with their special interest being only that they were taken from a former abbey that once sat on the same site, grossly misrepresenting the evidence presented and the site's actual special interest. The third player is the local council's heritage planning officer, who appeared to be purely concerned with planning compliance and not conservation, the reason for planning engagement. They dismissed themselves from interpreting the archaeological report with an open-ended statement that neither confirmed nor disagreed with its conclusions, but misled by inferring there was copious opinion, with more to come, and the world should wait to see what is true and what is not. It was a ridiculous statement to make. Even with a modicum of knowledge, considering the officer's role, the quality of the report in front of them would have informed the officer that the report was unusually detailed in comparison to most historical understanding presented. And in particular, the Victorian report that conditioned the errant detail of the church's historic property listing in 1971. The council's heritage planning officer should have considered if the two academics referred by academia as the best specialists to critique the discovery had failed to dismantle it with any cogent and supportable argument, that logic dictated the discovery more likely to be genuine than not. That if in over 100 years only one significant study on the bells had been presented and the best academia had to offer failed to dismantle it, and being aware of the ubiquitous philosophy of academics not challenging existing historical academic narrative, there would be no other objective academic research to follow. All of this information was at the officer's disposal. Even if the officer could not conclude the bell's extraordinary and exceptional provenance, prudent and professional consideration should have dictated that without evidence disavowal and the obvious deficiencies presented by the current listing, the Holywood bells being most likely some of the most precious bells in the world, a rational decision could only be taken after it was confirmed, either way. This same unprofessional attitude displayed by the council's own heritage planning officer was exhibited by the Scottish Government's planning officers within the Planning and Environmental Appeals Division on review. We were repeatedly warned by planning experts not to expect logicality in the planners' decisions. The planners' officers' deficiencies, well illustrated in their town planners' own code of practice, will be a topic for another video, as planning is a highly emotive subject and deserves focused consideration, discussing in more detail the motives, partiality, misbehaviours and competencies of the planning officers concerned.
So were any of the factors regarding conservation, the three pillars of sustainability, and the requirement to understand heritage considered by those in the establishment, the local council, Historic Environment Scotland, and the Scottish Government, who have reviewed our case and dictated we are in breach of conservation laws? Have they discussed the problems and helped us find a solution? Well, the answer is no. The government's sole argument, joining the Council's and Historic Environment Scotland's condemnation of our actions, is based on the fact we removed the bells from the site without permission, and so removed the bell's historic connection, and that is the sum total of their concern. They are not interested in why we removed the bells, or how the bells should be treated, or the bell's extraordinary provenance. They are refusing to understand the site for what it was, signposted by the bells, a fundamental requirement in any decision making. The establishment are not presenting any argument to refute the discovery, because it has no supportable evidence or argument to refute it. The establishment only presents the argument the Knights Templar provenance of the bells is unimportant to any of their decision making, or the conservation of the site, its economic viability, or the site's security or public interest, which are in fact the pillars of sustainability, the foundation of heritage conservation. The establishment arguing Digger and I have broken the bell's link to the site as the most important factor in this affair is a poor argument if the establishment refuse to acknowledge or recognise what that link actually is. The local council made it clear it was not interested in the Holywood site, nor its history, nor the conservation of the church, or the past mistakes that were made, or the extraordinary discovery, or what it should mean to the region. Its disinterest is evidenced by its rejection and disinterest in our petitions, with the 4 ward councillors regrettably mirroring the lack of community interest. The local council's only concern is limited to its statutory planning function, bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy, without understanding its purpose. Bureaucracy which the council implemented without any consideration of the discovery, the sustainability of the church, or correctly understanding the site, or the previous mistakes made in drawing up an unworkable conservation plan, including the council's complicity with the prior inappropriate planning permission. The council states in its own planning enforcement charter, of course the council are referring to mistakes made by the public, not the council. The council did not determine if the listing was sound before it took enforcement action, and it did not confirm if the listing and the bells actually reflected the special interest of the site. I will say it again and again, read our archaeological report for yourself. You cannot but agree that the record that informs the current historic property listing had been informed by ill-formed Victorian theory, and the evidence we present speaks for itself. The Holywood site and the Holywood bells once belonged to the Knights Templar, a very special provenance indeed, very special. Google provenanced Templar artifacts and you will find none but a few charted documents. Even Historic Environment Scotland knew the listing was not sound because Historic Environment Scotland notified the Directorate for Culture and External Affairs in April 2025 that they would consider removing the bells from the listing if the bells were not returned. We raised the question, why would Historic Environment Scotland even consider removing the bells from the listing and legal protection? Our legal advocate at the time suggested it was because the agency recognised the bell's special provenance and the controversy it presented, and so wanted to remove the agency's consideration of the bells and further involvement. So prejudiced was the agency against the owners of Holywood and the discovery. It's not surprising Digger and I are paying for the council's mistakes, and considering the council's long-standing reputation for poor service and a general lack of professional behaviour amongst its staff, we should not have experienced diligence or high-functioning council personnel imbued with exceptional qualities of critical thinking, challenge, professionality and predictive intelligence to review our case. Digger and I, like many of the public, are left paying for the mistakes of our poor governance. We have not only paid for errant planning permissions created in 2014 in a building that was never fit to be converted into a dwelling, and left with priceless artefacts that should have already been deposited in a museum, especially after 2009 when the public mounted a campaign to have the bells recited, a campaign rejected by the council. But now we have significant court and legal fees to find in order to challenge the council's refusal to allow retrospective planning permission to remove the bells temporarily while the property awaits a new owner, despite the government and the local council's own planning officers' only objection being with the bells' permanent removal. The council are unreasonably dictating we part refurbish the church, costing hundreds of thousands of pounds, simply to satisfy a wholly bureaucratic decision which has nothing to do with conservation or protection for the bells or for the church. A church with no current workable conservation plan and new owners to find. A church in dire need for the recognition it deserves for what it actually contains. The problem is aggravated and we are facing legal action against us because the council refused to maintain any meaningful dialogue with Digger and I and have never done so. So the council are unaware of the current circumstances and ongoing issues, and ignorance never generates sound decision making. To date, this sorry affair has cost Digger and I in excess of £200,000 and we owe £30,000 more. We have spent significantly more than the original estimate to create a home out of Holywood Church, and the council would have us significantly add to that bill without any benefit to anyone, simply because the council refuses to properly consider the conservation of the site's history and the benefits it should be bringing to the area in terms of income, tourism and prestige, and Scotland's reputation. Yes, mistakes can be made, and it is very annoying when we have to pay for them. But even more annoying when the establishment punishes us for our mistakes, while the establishment lacks the humility to admit its own mistakes when they are made. And there is a significant lack of humility exhibited in this case. And without humility, there is, of course, no wisdom.
The council insists the bells and church are not at risk from vandalism and arson while it remains disused and undeveloped. Defying the reality, empty churches are increasingly targets for vandalism and arson across the UK and Scotland. The local council and Scottish Government claim the site presents no risk, but their argument has no credence, considering the vandalism Holywood Church has already experienced, as evidenced in its broken stained glass windows and forced entry that coerced the last developer to camp inside the church and me to camp outside since 2020. I have moved off the site 3 times since 2020, employing a security guard for a brief period in 2023, and each and every time I have had to return due to vandalism. The council's statement the area only attracts grave visitors and dog walkers is ridiculous invention to play down the very real risks empty churches face, not to mention those churches that are connected with the world's only Provenance Knights Templar artifacts. And it is even more ridiculous for the establishment to declare there is no risk whatsoever to the bells if they're returned without the church being developed, particularly considering the high crime rate in Dumfries and Galloway in comparison to other areas in Scotland and the UK.
Without any commitment to the discovery here at Holywood or its historic church from the state, the local authority or the heritage sector in Scotland as a whole, ensuring Holywood has a sustainable future has presented itself as a huge challenge to Digger and I. Since any house conversion is not financially practical and a museum is not commercially viable, Holywood Church is destined to slowly decay from disuse. There is little commitment to heritage in Scotland outside a few well-placed and notable exceptions, and very little in Dumfries and Galloway unless it is in private hands. The government agency Historic Environment Scotland has graphically demonstrated this lack of state commitment through the systemic denigration of the heritage in its own care, well reported in the press. This denigration has existed for decades without positive intervention by the Scottish Government or the heritage sector. Complaints see little action, as all watch heritage crumble around them. Scotland, despite its good laws and good policies and its significant heritage sector, with all the resource that comes with it, does indeed offer a conservation paradox. I don't recall Scotland being a country that seeks out to revile its history or actively neglects it or even willfully destroys it. Indeed, Scotland sells itself to the world on its unique culture, its history, its medieval heroes and heritage and historical environment. But here we are. The history of Holywood is willfully rejected by the Scottish and local government, not because they have evidence that allows them to reject the history we present, but because they deem it unimportant to the nation or its contribution to world history. Instead of bringing benefit to Scotland and sustainable conservation to the heritage here at Holywood, the Scottish Government, through its agents, perpetuates scandal, something the Scottish Government and regrettably the public are growing ever more comfortable with. I ask the question, bearing in mind the establishment cannot refute our discovery with evidence. Are the establishment's actions born out of stupidity and prejudice, the two often travelling hand in hand? Or is a greater conspiracy at play to deliberately run down Scottish and in particular British and Christian heritage? I personally think it's the former, although I accept there is a great deal of anti-British and anti-Christian sentiment generated by left-leaning historians and areas of the establishment, denigrating the country's imperialistic and Christian past, just as Victorian historians over 100 years ago celebrated it. But this affair can only be classed as stupidity, a lose-lose situation, because by the establishment's actions, burying their heads in the sand and ignoring the discovery here at Holywood, using planning law clumsily to avoid dealing with a significant discovery, only brings public attention onto the discovery and the establishment's refusal to acknowledge it. Judicial intervention should bring focus to the question of the provenance of the bells, and provenance is the reason they were removed for security against planning law. And raise the question, was Digger and I's actions reasonable under the circumstances?
The local council are forcing us to argue our case in the Scottish courts. And it is an opportunity we must use to benefit history, truth and virtue, regardless of the cost. Unfortunately, we are not in a position when this video was made to meet that cost. We will not be able to return the bells to Holywood Church, and we will not return the bells to Holywood Church from their temporary storage while the church remains in a dilapidated condition without a workable conservation plan for the building. We would be fools to do anything else. We'd be fools to do anything to risk the bell's future simply to appease a delinquent Scottish authority who have turned what should have been a good news event into another Scottish scandal. We need your help. We need your help to defend Digger and I and the Templar Bells of Scotland, because the establishment will not help us. Digger and I are currently alone, and this sorry affair has brought us, at the time this video was made, to the point of bankruptcy, all because we did what should have been done a long time ago. Please like and share this video. We can only circumvent poor conservation management by the voice of a people's crusade, by the voice of people who are sick of seeing their heritage mismanaged, sick of being led down a path not of societal and public benefit, preserving our history, but the corruption of merit by a malignant establishment that values itself more than the public they serve. Please subscribe to our channel. Help us get views and interaction. Help us find good people to protect our history and our legacy. Register for updates on our website. Read about our campaign. Sign our petition. And in the meantime, please buy me a coffee in the link below, or buy our book given in the link on our website. And Iddy and I hope to see you next time.